I need to break up with my abuser, but I love him. I want to buy this shiny new smartphone, but I can't afford it. I would love to climb the Everest, but I'm 62 years old. These are contradictory thoughts. They conflict with each other. They create internal stress, inner conflict. This is the topic of today's video. Dissonances, how to cope with them and how to solve them. And apropos dissonance, my name is Sam Vaknin, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism, you guessed it, Revisited. I'm also a former visiting professor of psychology. Dissonance, a word I love and use a lot in all my videos. The most famous of all the types of dissonances is cognitive dissonance, simultaneously entertaining or harboring or having two or more conflicting pieces of information or contradictory thoughts of the kind that opened this video. But before we go there, before we go to how to solve the solutions, a few videos you should watch. Watch the video about structural dissociation. They're all on my channel, of course. Watch the video about structural dissociation. Watch the video about Intrapsychic Activation Model, IPAM. And watch a video about the horny, the thorny, not the horny, the thorny horns of the dilemma and how to solve dilemmas. It's also on my channel, horns and everything. Dissonance can be easily described as two parts interacting. So there is this theory of parts. There is something called internal family system, where there's one type of parts. There are trauma theories, which are based on theories of parts. In general, it is the belief that we don't have a unitary personality, but that there are parts inside us which interact with each other, which maintain a kind of ongoing dialogue or polylogue, and that it is our behaviors are the outcomes of this constant interlocution between the parts. So we can describe cognitive dissonance as a clash of cognitions, clash of emotions sometimes. We'll discuss it a bit later. The clash of internal processes in an allegedly, ideally constructed unitary self. As you well know, those of you who have suffered through my channel, I'm dead set against this description of the human psyche. I think it's counterfactual and nonsensical. People are not unitary. They are in flux. They are much more like a river than like a pond or an ocean. So, because they are in flux, of course, they have parts. I'm a strong adherent of the belief that what we used to call self is actually an assemblage, a theater troupe, a collection, a kaleidoscopic collection or collage of shimmering portions or shimmering parts that come into being on the fly and then disappear again. We are dream creatures in this sense and highly surrealistic. So a cognitive dissonance can be described as a clash between two cognitions in a unitary self, but it's a bad description in my view. It doesn't fit reality. A much better description would be two contradictory parts interacting. When two contradictory parts interact, we have a dissonance. An even better description would be two types of parts interacting. For example, there's a famous mainstream theory of trauma, which posits that we have two types of parts, apparently normal parts and emotional parts, A and P and EP. And I think when these two types of parts interact, they create dissonance. And coming back to my own work, which is based on the work of Bromberg and others, self-states. A dissonance can easily be described or captured in terms of self-states. Two coextant self-states interacting. When we have two self-states jostling for control of the mind, fighting each other out, conflicting, then we have dissonance. And this usually happens in the switching phase from one self-state to another. Again, watch my video on IPAM, Intrapsychic Activation Model. So, to summarize this part of the video, dissonance can be described as a clash of cognitions within a unitary self. It can be described as a clash of two parts or more within a personality. It can be described as a conflict between two types of parts. For example, apparently normal parts and emotional parts, A and P and EP. This is especially valid in trauma studies. And it can be described perhaps most cogently and most comprehensively using the self-states model. When one self-state has to yield to another because the environment has changed, when one self-state has to turn itself off, become deactivated, and vacate itself so that another self-state can take over, a self-state which is much better suited to cope with the new environment, much more adapted to the new environment. When this switching happens, there are moments of coexistence of both self-states. And those moments are what we call dissonance. So, cognitive dissonance in orthodoxy, the way we teach it in university, is when someone or their parts or their self-states hold simultaneously two conflicting views, values, bits of information, which call for diametrically opposed decisions or actions. I gave 3 examples at the beginning of the video. And this state of affairs, where there are 2 or more equally potent alternatives, they hold the same attraction, they are equally seductive, they are equally compelling and convincing. What to do? How to resolve this equipotency? How to extricate yourself from a situation where wherever you turn, there's the fear of missing out. So this state of affairs generates an inner conflict and triggers several primitive infantile defense mechanisms, such as denial, splitting, projection, and reaction formation. One way to cope with this predicament is to transition from dissonance to consonance. Now, how can this be accomplished? You need to come up with a reconciling narrative, a theory of everything, a scientific theory, if you wish, which seamlessly accommodates both conflicting points of view or both contradictory sets of data. You need to take everything that disagrees and you put them together in a theory. So, for example, when we see event A and we see event B, we can say that event A caused event B. We can say that event B caused event A. We can even say that they are correlated. In other words, event A and event B move in the same direction, in the same way, or perform the same functions. This is one way of looking at things. And this is the unitary self way. But there's an alternative. You could assume that there is an event C or an entity C, and C coordinates A and B. It is C that gives A and B meaning, direction, sense, and causes them to interact in a way that appears to be causative. So, as you see, there are many ways to accommodate any set of facts. So when you have 2 conflicting views, 2 conflicting wishes, and you can't reconcile them. One way to do that is to write a story, because we are all storytellers, to write a narrative, a script, where both A and B make sense, actually, where they become inevitable preconditions for each other, naturally and seamlessly compatible. This can be done, always. Here's a rule. Let's call it Vaknin's rule, because had I been modest, I would have been perfect. So, Vaknin's rule. For every two conflicting pieces of data, A and B, there's always a narrative C that accommodates them perfectly and resolves the dissonance. If this is true, if this were true, then this is the solution to dissonance. And I'm going to demonstrate to you 5 options of constructing such soothing fiction. Because yes, to resolve a dissonance, you need to self-deceive. You need to lie to yourself. I'm sorry, there's absolutely no other way. Is it moral? It's immoral to lie to other people, but it's perfectly okay to lie to yourself if the lie doesn't create problems which are far greater than the problems it solves. Actually, when we construct narratives of our lives, autobiographical narratives, moralistic narratives, morality plays, when we cast ourselves as victims or whatever, we are deceiving ourselves. We are adhering to a piece of fiction that usually we are the authors of. We authored this piece of fiction. So, here are the 5 ways to resolve a dissonance. The first way, temporal. A is true at one time, and not A is true at another time, at another period. So if we have A and not A simultaneously, we have a dissonance, because they can't both be true. Yet they're equally compelling, equally convincing, appear to be equally veracious and truthful. How do we resolve this? We simply say A is valid on Tuesday and not A is valid on Thursday. We can also say A is a transient state of affairs, not A is the rule. These are temporal solutions. If you apply these solutions, you will rid yourself of the dissonance. The second type of solutions is what I call reactive solutions. They go like this. A is the normal. A is the standard. A is common. A should prevail. Not A happened because of some trigger, provocation, change in circumstances, environments, or conditions. In short, not A is a fluke, an aberration. It's a side effect. It's a byproduct. It's not the real thing. Not A is abnormal and therefore a mere curiosity. We should stick to A. And I call this solution the reactive solution. The third solution is the inclusive solution. And here is how it goes. The inclusive solution says both A and not A are pieces of a bigger puzzle, a picture, a theory, the entity C that I mentioned before. Their contradistinction and contradiction, they are only apparent because we have no access to the bigger picture. We have no awareness of the true and full picture. We have no knowledge or capacity to realize the entire dimension of the reality involved. So, for example, God is good, but the world is full of evil. A and not A. This problem is known as theodicy. And I have an essay on my website dedicated to the theodicy. So A, God is good, not A, the world, God's creation, is evil. How do we reconcile this? We say God has the big picture. We have no access to God's mind. So we can't become aware of the big picture. And as long as we are denied access to the big picture, the contradiction between A and not A is only apparent. It reflects our own limitations, our shortcomings, our finitude as mere mortals. That's an example of an inclusive solution, which is very common and typical in ideologies, in religions, and when we adhere to big symbol sets like the nation state. The fourth type of solution is denial. And that's a very common solution. It's also considered to be a psychological defense mechanism. And this defense mechanism is often deployed to get rid of dissonance. Denial simply says both A and not A are true. They lead to the same conclusions. There is no contradiction. The contradiction is only apparent. Consider, for example, the following. My husband beats me up. My husband loves me. These are two sentences. A and apparently not A, because people usually beat up people they don't like, they don't love. Love and physical abuse don't and should never go together. So there should be a dissonance. There's A, my husband loves me. B, my husband places me in a hospital on a regular basis. How do you reconcile this? By claiming that there is no contradiction, denying the contradiction, denying it away, saying my husband's battering, my husband's physical violence only proves that he loves me. Physical abuse is his way of showing that he loves me. He's jealous, romantically jealous, that drives him to beat me up because he loves me. Contradiction solved. Contradiction gone. Mutual exclusivity dissolved. A and not A suddenly become true. Not only true, but they buttress each other. They support and prove each other. They become evidentiary. And finally, the last solution is the defensive solution. Both A and not A are valid, but only A applies to me, while not A applies to others, or may apply to others. This is a splitting solution. I'm going to repeat it because it's also very common, especially among people whose mental health is, how to put it gently, questionable. So the defensive solution is both A and not A are valid, but only A applies to me. So there's no problem. There's no contradiction. There's no clash or conflict. What about not A? If it is valid, equally valid, why doesn't it apply to me? Because it applies to other people. And this is known as splitting. I'm all good, they are all bad. I'm abusing someone, but he's bad, he deserves it. I am acting as an abuser, but I'm still a good person. And this is known as reactive abuse. So we are executing a murderer. Killing someone is bad, but killing a murderer is good. So A applies to me, not A applies to someone else. They are both valid, mind you, but not to me. Not as far as I'm concerned. Not A is bad. Not A is bad. That's why it applies to other people and not to me. This is, of course, projection. Not A is evil. It should be eradicated in other people. But they have the problem, not I. And this, of course, solves the dissonance. It's a form of splitting, a morality play. I'm all good, they're all bad. I'm all white, they're all black. This is very common in identity politics, in victimhood movements, in social activism, and in self-appointed vigilantes and justice fighters. The idea is that by eliminating not A in other people, we restore A to its rightful place as the sole viable, ethical, and moral alternative. And this is known as reaction formation. I behave in a vicious, malevolent way, that's true, but I'm doing this in order to eliminate a much bigger evil. Much bigger evil. I'm doing this for the common good. And I'm attacking evil and abusive people abusively and viciously because I'm on a moral crusade. And this is reaction formation. It's denying what's in you by attacking it in others. So if you are homosexual, a latent homosexual, you would be homophobic. You would say, I'm attacking homosexuality. It's immoral. It's horrible. But of course, it's only because you have homosexual inclinations and proclivities. You're a latent homosexual. You're denying it in yourself by attacking it in others. So as you see, the defensive resolution of dissonances involves multiple pathological defense mechanisms, such as splitting, projection, and reaction formation. Now, cognitive dissonance is only one of a family of dissonances. I'm going to describe briefly all of them, and you can take the same 5 solutions and apply them to each of these other types of dissonance. Start with a volitional dissonance, not cognitive, volitional. Volitional dissonance is when we act in ways which are perceived to be acratic, immoral, antisocial, rather than phronetic. When we perceive our actions to have been the outcomes of acrasia, acrasia means when you have a weak will, when you misbehave contrary to your own best judgment, when you're weak. So when we perceive our actions to have been the outcomes of weakness, personal weakness or weakness of character, known as acrasia, when we perceive our actions to have defied and flown in the face of phronesis, good judgment, excellence of character, habits conducive to a good life, eudaimonia, practical virtue. So when we perceive our own actions as the outcomes of weakness of character and denial of ethics, good judgment, and the good life, the ethical life, then we develop dissonance. Even hardened criminals develop volitional dissonance. That's why they keep justifying their behavior. Dissonance is intolerable. We resolve it by using a variety of mostly alloplastic psychological defense mechanisms. We blame others, displace, rationalize, and we use narrative solutions such as reframing. We also tend to externalize the locus of control. We say it wasn't our fault because it wasn't my fault, I couldn't do anything about it. I didn't have agency, self-efficacy, self-control, autonomy, or free will in this matter. It was imposed on me. There was nothing else I could have done. It wasn't my fault. Something or someone made me do it, or inexorably and irresistibly led to what had happened. Someone else's problem and responsibility, not mine. And this is a very common defense in volitional dissonance. And then we have emotional dissonance, also known as ambivalence, experiencing 2 opposing emotions, such as love and hate, which are elicited by the same object. We have axiological dissonance. It occurs when 2 dearly upheld and deeply felt values are incompatible. A religious soldier, his religion tells him, thou shalt not kill, but his nation state expects him to kill. This would create an axiological dissonance. Pacifism is a typical reaction. And then we have deontic dissonance, It is a subspecies of the axiological dissonance. It's when one has two irreconcilable duties or obligations. So a working mother, she has an obligation to her children, but she has to work 3 shifts because she can't survive otherwise. And she feels guilty, she feels bad, she has a deontic dissonance. And finally, there's the attitudinal dissonance. It is an inner conflict between two internalized beliefs, attitudes, statements, or propositions held to be equally true and valid. These are all the dissonances. And again, remember, the orthodox view, the current view, is that dissonances are conflicts within a system. My belief is that dissonances can never occur in a self-consistent system. That's Kurt Gödel's famous theorems in logic. For a dissonance to occur, the system must compete with other systems. So parts compete with parts. Type of parts compete with types of parts. Functions compete with functions. Or, much more likely, self-states compete with self-states. This competition creates a sense of dissonance. And we use the 5 solutions that I've described to resolve them. The 5th one, the defensive type of solution, is what we call mental illness.